Record. So with that, I will turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be able to offer this workshop to you virtually. As it was mentioned, I'm Andrea Honigfeld, and I work at Molloy College, which is the best kept secret of New York. It is a small Catholic institution, and I've been there for 21 years. And I actually direct a doctoral program focusing on social justice and equity. Before that, I was the TESOL coordinator and a TESOL professor for 15 years. And if you are not sure where to place Molloy, that's quite all right. It's where that happy face is on Long Island, about 30-40 minutes from New York City. And I also want to give a special thank you to my co-authors, Audrey Cohan, Maria Dove, and Carrie McDermott, who contributed to the 2 books that I'm basing my presentation on today. Corwin Press is the publisher, and Claribel Gonzalez is the illustrator of both of my books. She's a Buffalo-based ENL teacher, English as a new language teacher, and she's also a sketchnote artist extraordinaire that you will see in my presentation later on. So I'd like to invite you to participate in the chat box by introducing yourselves with 2 P's. What is your position, professional position, and what is your passion? What is something that you're passionate about? So my 2 P's would be author, consultant, and professor. I guess I have a lot of different professional positions, and my passion is ice skating. So if there's anything that you're passionate about, it can be professional, it could be something after work or on the weekend or with your children. So if you could please share in the chat box your position and something that you're passionate about by virtue of introductions. Thank you, Tabitha, for starting us off. I guess all the answers will be coming in, and lots of different hobbies, passions. I love to see sport activities, being outside. All right, and your professional positions as well. Teaching in various programs, focusing on serving multilingual learners or preparing teachers to teach ESL. All right, I'm keeping an eye on the chat box, just inviting any other introductions, but if you are not comfortable sharing anymore, that's quite all right as well. You could still add if you wish to do that. All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Greer. Thank you, Kaylin. Okay, so today's session has the following goals. We are going to define equity work in the post-pandemic classroom, even though we're not really 100% on the other side of the pandemic yet. We are going to explore 4 essential strategies to support equitable learning opportunities for our multilingual learners. And I will be weaving in teacher collaboration, cooperation, even co-teaching into this exploration. And finally, my goal is that you leave this session with lots of strategies that you can apply to your own context. And thank you everybody else who still added to the chat box. Thank you, Yvette. Thank you, Ernest, for joining us and for being here and sharing your professional and personal passions. So the essential questions that I have for today are as follows. What drives you to pursue equity for your English learners, multilingual learners in your daily work? And what is your why? Simon Sinek, modern day philosopher, reminded us that we always have to start with our why. And once we have established our why, then we can go on and explore some impactful hows. So I'm going to ask you again to participate in the chat box just by simply dropping a number or a short note, a couple of words regarding the most urgent challenge or challenges that you're facing in your context. What are you hearing? Are you hearing about the COVID slide, learning loss, retention of some underserved students. Maybe there's a lot more focus on remediation when it comes to our English learners and their language development. Are you hearing, are you concerned about any deficit thinking that dominates the public discourse, or impact on students' social emotional well-being, or something else that you see as especially challenging or concerning to you? So you could participate by simply dropping a number into the chat box or adding anything else to this conversation. I see number 5 is getting a lot of attention. And I'm married to a family therapist, and I could certainly testify to that, that just the number of children, the number of families that are also seeking counseling, seeking that kind of social emotional support that was there before the pandemic, but not to the degree to which we're seeing it now. So all of these, Jacqueline says, 1 and 2, the COVID slide and the learning loss that we are hearing about all the time. And today, Kaylin says, is really number 4 that bothers you, the deficit thinking that dominates our discourse. So indeed, what I want to start saying is that there are tremendous dangers of deficit thinking in our public discourse. If you think about what is not there, what the students are lacking or missing, it could lead to tracking our multilingual learners into long-term remediation. And we can't remediate what hasn't been built yet. So when we focus on our English learners, multilingual learners, we have to take an asset-based positive approach and creating a trajectory of growth for our students. A growth-oriented mindset looks into the future. A deficit-oriented mindset keeps us in the past, and we keep looking backwards. We need to look forward in these difficult times. And another aspect of deficit thinking is the dangers of significantly impacting our students' self-concept and social emotional well-being that you have already mentioned earlier when you participated in the chat box. So a quick yes or no in the chat box. How many of you have seen the US Department of Education Newcomer Toolkit or ELL Toolkit? There are a number of these amazing publications out there, some of the best kept secrets of our Department of Education. And this is a screenshot from a particular chapter in this Newcomer Toolkit that discusses the immigrant experience. Let's see if you're, I mentioned that this is a best kept secret, so don't feel bad if you have not seen it yet. If you just Google US Department of Education Newcomer Toolkit or ELL Toolkit, it is going to pop up. So maybe I can ask Tabitha if you can search for it and maybe even place it in the chat box before the session is over. We'll have that link for you. So what I appreciated about this particular diagram is capturing the core stressors as trauma, acculturation, resettlement, and isolation. But please notice the date. This was in 2016, way before COVID. And if we think about the past 2 years and even our current conditions, all of these core stressors have been amplified by this global crisis that we're still trying to get on the other side of. So which of these have you seen a lot of in your own context? Just try to lift a couple of ideas from this slide and put it in the chat box. Have you seen that your students are more isolated or lonely, or have you seen that they are stressed out over some concerns related to basic needs or financial hardships? What is something that's so critical in your context that you'd like to share in the chat box? Basic needs, thank you. And the trauma that both COVID and other challenges have caused our immigrant families. All right, I see that those are the two that keep popping up. And loneliness and isolation certainly were very painful for all of us as we were in quarantine or sheltering in place and so forth. And yes, Tabitha, thank you so much. You found it right away. So that's the document that I was referring to, the Newcomers Toolkit, published by the US Department of Education. All right, but what were some silver linings? Think about your own personal or professional lives. And we're now switching to positive psychology and an asset-based, strengths-based approach, or a type of approach to organizational psychology that I fully embrace in my own work, referred to as appreciative inquiry. So let's start with what we have. So what are some silver linings? What are some positive experiences you could think about professionally or personally that COVID brought about, or just the crisis brought about for you or for your students? What has happened in your own context? While you're thinking and adding something to the chat box, I can happily share with you that I left New York and I live in Vermont. I always wanted to move to Vermont. So COVID became the catalyst for change for my family. And now we're raising our children in Vermont, which is a huge culture shock. And we are adjusting to that, but have been a wonderful experience so far. So thank you, Kaylin, for sharing that more flexible instructional models were introduced to fit your students' schedules. So we have expanded our toolkit, relationship building, yes, and being guests in each other's homes, definitely, seeing each other's pets and children and siblings and so forth. That's right. So there were lots of opportunities for us to connect with our students' families through virtual interactions. All right, keep them coming. If there are any other silver linings that you can think of, I would love to see them in the chat box. Yeah, some students benefited from virtual teaching, definitely, not all. So we're not making sweeping generalizations, definitely. It has not been easy for everybody in this particular context. And since we're talking about how it has not been easy, I'd like to share with you a paragraph from an essay that Arundhati Roy, well-known Indian novelist, wrote in the Financial Times early on in the pandemic. This is what she had to say. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So in the beginning of the pandemic, when I came across this essay, as I mentioned in 2020 or maybe early 2021 by Arundhati Roy, this metaphor of a portal, a gateway between pre-COVID and post-COVID, between two worlds, would just not leave me alone. I don't know what your reaction to this quote is, but it gives me shivers. It's just so powerful. It kept me up at night to think about what a historic moment we lived through and what are we going to do with this moment in our lives. And then I thought, well, what if we also thought about an educational portal? And then it did not leave me alone at all. Then I really felt that I need to write a book about that. What if we're going to conceptualize this pandemic as an educational equity portal through the multilingual lens? So that's basically the origin story of my book. And I'm going to ask you to think along with me, stay with this thought experiment if you are relating to it. So what do we leave behind when we enter a portal, especially in this context? What do you want to leave behind? What is something that the pandemic made you leave behind when it comes to some educational practices? Some of these things we left behind temporarily and some we might have left behind forever, but what would be something that you would want to leave behind? Just enter into the chat box a couple of ideas that come to mind. Photocopying. All right. Thank you, Jacqueline. That is indeed something that we have learned to live without, printing so much paper and relying on electronic tools, the copy machine. Yes. So we would want to leave those tools behind and use more technology-based 21st century tools. All right, anything else that you want to leave behind? Okay, so carrying around papers. Yes, Kaylin, neglecting social emotional aspect of learning. And often we think we need all those things, but we actually do not need so much paper to learn. Also, the tremendous inequities in education that all of a sudden, as former President Obama mentioned, the pandemic, the crisis pulled the curtain back for us, all of us, to see the inequities that have always been there. That's why I love his metaphor of pulling that curtain back, to be able to see more, see better what is really happening in our society. So how about on the other side of the portal? What do you want to take with you? What is valuable for you? What is necessary for you to take it to the other side of the pandemic? And for inspiration, as promised, I'm going to share the first sketch note by Claribel Gonzalez, who captured my entire book with my colleagues on a single page. And there is your educational portal, taking us from one side of the pandemic to the other side of the pandemic, focusing on strength, assets, and educational equity. But in your experience, what would you like to take, or what do you need to take with you to the other side of the pandemic, on the other side of this portal? What would be something you could be inspired by, some of those ideas on the slide, or just on your own? What is something so important to you that you do not want to compromise on them and need them on the other side of the pandemic? Any ideas that you'd like to share? Attending to social emotional aspects. Exactly. So it's not just an afterthought, not just a half an hour program once a week, but it's something that we fully embrace. Thank you. I think that's an ongoing theme that I'm hearing from every group that I work with, how critical it is to focus, give our focus not just to the language, literacy, or content development, academic development, our students, but also their social emotional well-being and development. And flexible instructional models for adults, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kaylin, for adding that. So as I earlier introduced, this is Claribel Gonzalez, who illustrated this book. And the 4 equity strategies that we unpack in this publication include amplifying the talent, spirits, and personal powers of our students, recalibrating the curriculum, and I will go into each of these, offer some examples and some explanations, some descriptions of these strategies, in order to accelerate learning for our multilingual learners, teaching and assessing so that we could build or enhance our students' autonomy, agency, and resilience, and finally, harnessing the power of connections and relationships. So if you look at the 4 strategies, the first strategy is about the who, about the child, about the students. The second one is about the what. What are we teaching? Are we teaching what we really need to teach in this changing world? And how could we make sure that our curriculum is relevant and meaningful to 21st century learning? And how do we accelerate learning? And accelerate does not mean we're going to speak faster or cover more or skip around in the curriculum or speeding ahead. I will go into that a little later too, what acceleration for multilingual learners could look like. Number 3 is the how. How are we going to make sure that both our instructional and assessment practices focus on students' needs to the unique angles of autonomy, agency, and resilience? And finally, the umbrella strategy, which holds everything together, is the importance of relationships and connections, that social emotional piece that all of you mentioned many times in the chat box already. All right, so where do you see some affirmations? Just please drop that number in the chat box. Any of these strategies where you were nodding like, yes, exactly, that's what we need to focus on. Is there one particular equity strategy that really resonates with you, where you feel that that has to be a priority? So where are your affirmations of your own thinking? You were thinking along those same lines, or maybe you have already practicing the exact same strategy. You might not have attached the exact same label on those strategies or descriptors on those strategies, but some of these strategies have already been important to you. And these are overarching strategies or practices. All right, it seems like number 4 is very well regarded here. So harnessing the power of connections and relationships. We could probably never go back the way we used to. Maybe just had a little bit more distance between the students and the families. Now we put our students and relationships with them and with families front and center. I see all the numbers popping up. So thank you so much for highlighting number 3. So that's the instructional and assessment practices that you feel affirmed around, and amplifying the talent, spirits, and personal powers of our English learners, multilingual learners too. So as I mentioned, we really have to start with our whys. Why is it important for us to talk about equity? Why is it important to connect it to teacher collaboration? We can't do the work alone. If you looked at this list of strategies, the job is too important and too big. So that's where collaboration fits into this picture. So let's start with your why. What is your why? What is something that makes you tick, that makes you get up every day and do this work, no matter how difficult it has been? What's that driving force in you? If you wanted to share in the chat box or just reflect on that for a moment, I certainly will not call on anybody or expect answers from all of you in the chat box. It's just if you feel that you wish to share, or simply quietly reflect on how you would start defining your why in education. And the person that I refer to that is Simon Sinek. You could certainly look him up. He has a TED Talk on YouTube. I'm forgetting, maybe about 15 million hits on how we have to start with our why and why we have to start with our why. All right, so because I'm inviting you to think about your why or your whys, I'm also sharing with you a summary chart from chapter 1 in which my co-authors and I defined our why. Our whys are 2 types of whys. The first kind of why is a rationale. What's the purpose? Why are we doing this? And the second kind of why is the importance. Why does it matter? And thank you so much for sharing a couple of your whys as well, and focusing on your students, putting your students front and center in your work as well. And that's the driving force that gets you to work every day and helps you put your very best foot forward. So what we did in this summary chart that I'm going to walk you through, there are 4 equity strategies, and we define the why or whys for each of them. So when I mentioned the importance of focusing on our students, just like you did in the chat box, our rationale for doing that is that we have to affirm our students every single day. We need to see them. They need to feel seen, valued, and affirmed and appreciated for who they are and what they can do, rather than any kind of deficits or any kind of gaps in their knowledge or understanding. When we take this assets-based or strengths-based approach, they come to school and they offer their very best quite differently. So in this book, we also focus on deliberate daily actions. What can we do every single day? And there you see Claribel Gonzalez's sketch note capturing the entire chapter that focuses on embracing diversity, supporting our students' cultural and linguistic resilience, and making sure that our teaching is relevant culturally and linguistically. So how do we do that? We talk with and listen to our students. We get to know each and every one of them and also understand their full humanity. What kind of lived experiences are they bringing to the classroom? And we have to invite multiple modalities of communication and expression so that the students have multiple channels, multilingual opportunities to tell us about their lived experiences. And here are a couple of examples. So if we start with the WIDA framework, you'll see a with a portrait on the left-hand side. And here is an adapted version that's in my co-planning book of another kind of portrait that's even more focused on the student's own agency, because the student created that about herself. So she was able to share in this portrait on a Google slide something really important about her background, her hobbies, her strengths, and even though the WIDA scores are there, some factual information is offered. The most important element of that portrait is the student's own voice, so that she could share about her background and what's important to her. Another way that we could think about creating this asset-based approach to who our students are and where they come from is welcoming all of those languages and experiences. And here I'm taking you on a short field trip to Illinois, to Country Meadows Elementary School, where you could see this beautiful bulletin board welcoming families and welcoming visitors in 29 different languages and counting, because you could replace that 29. So the second equity strategy is about the what, about the curriculum. And I mentioned earlier that I'm going to go a little deeper into unpacking what that acceleration is. How do we make sure that, first of all, we critically examine our curriculum and make sure that our students see themselves in the curriculum, that their cultural and historical experiences and perspectives are reflected in the curriculum. And the reason why we would do that is that the curriculum that they are learning is culturally, historically, and linguistically responsive and sustaining for their own learning, so that the students could make those meaningful connections between what they're learning and what they're learning in school and out of school. And the acceleration comes from integrating the content and the language dimensions of that curriculum, so that teachers don't work in isolation or in silos, that all teachers embrace that we in fact have to teach the language of mathematics. And the acceleration comes from integrating rather than separating the linguistic or language dimensions of the curriculum from the content. So let's see some examples. The deliberate daily actions connected to this strategy include recalibrating the curriculum to make sure that it's relevant to the kids, relevant to our current times, relevant to the socio-political context in which we teach, so that we add criticality into our curriculum, that it's rigorous, so that we're not watering down or simplifying for our students, but we scaffold up, and it's relational, so that the students could relate to what is happening in the classroom. And the integration that we mentioned earlier, content and language integration through SciUp, has been around for quite some time, for over 2 decades. But in this publication, we're also strongly arguing that we have to connect content, language, literacy, disciplinary literacy, the unique features of language and literacy in every content area, as well as social emotional learning. So this is no small feat. It's a multidimensional kind of curriculum mapping, curriculum alignment, and that's why we need to collaborate. Not one teacher could sit down and just quickly produce curricula that would be so relevant and rigorous, as well as relational to the students, that could consider the lived experiences of every child. So we need to collaborate and put our heads together to achieve that. And here is a diagram that would capture how to do that kind of recalibration, and going through these various questions that we can reflect on: what we teach, how we do that, how we plan as we deliberately and intentionally integrate content and language. We keep questioning and interrogating what kind of language and literacy practices are needed for the students to access the curriculum and to be able to participate in the instructional practices. So it's the two-way street of both being on the receptive or interpretive end, as well as the productive end of learning. Equitable assessment measures and practices will be really, really important. So grading and assessment will have to be separated for our multilingual learners, and making sure that progress monitoring drives our assessment practices. And advocacy for equity needs to be also part of our curriculum. So examining whose faces, whose stories, whose experiences are reflected in the books that we read, and so forth. And what does it look like? So inviting educators to conduct a curriculum equity audit is a possible first step. And in the co-planning book, we have created a checklist for high quality curriculum for English learners and multilingual learners to be able to reflect on the degree to which the components are present in the curricula that you are teaching. And again, here is an example. I'm taking you to Prince William County schools. This was pre-pandemic. As you could see, the children are not wearing masks here. But in Westgate Elementary School that I was very fortunate to visit a few years ago, I saw this most amazing 5th grade co-taught science lesson about mixtures and solutions. You could see some elements of that science experiment done in a way that the newcomer students were fully engaged. The 2 teachers set up 8 learning stations. 1 teacher was monitoring the entire class. The other teacher was traveling with the group of newcomers who were able to understand and communicate in multiple languages through multiple modalities with the teacher and with each other about the grade appropriate content. All right, so before we continue, I'd like to stop for a moment and ask you in the chat box, just what stood out for you so far? Let's stop and process for a moment. What is something that will stick, something that just made you ponder, made you pause in what I have presented so far, something that resonated with you? Sometimes I like to refer to this as an aha moment or an affirmation. So if there were any aha moments for you or any affirmations so far, something that you could relate to, or something that you might have a question about, if you could please share that in the chat box before we continue with the 3rd equity strategy. So far we talked about the who and the what, and we're going to continue with the how. Even though all 3 really intertwine very easily because we focus on our students, we teach the students the curriculum rather than the other way around. So the students come first when we design instruction, and when we implement a multidimensional type of practice in our classroom, we also consider our students' needs. All right, thank you so much, Tabitha, for sharing that. Let's start by affirming who they are, what they can do, taking that asset-based approach. I mentioned earlier that appreciative inquiry is a positive psychology practice that I incorporate in my coaching and in my own teaching when I work with educators. So always looking at what we can affirm, what is there, what is in place, and we build on that. Then our trajectory is a strengths-based, future-oriented trajectory. Yes, thank you so much, Greer, about inclusion for else, focusing on their full engagement. So that, yes, indeed, they can do. And yes, that Westgate Elementary School was in Virginia, in Prince William County. All right, so that was your first teaching, though. Yes, it is in Manassas. Oh my gosh, maybe we have even met many years ago. 1st grade memories. I think we have to catch up after the workshop.
It was a long time. I think it was, I don't know, I've been teaching for 15 years, so that's my very first job.
Oh, wow. Well, I wasn't there 15 years ago. I think,
Yeah.
no, it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, I could tell that. Yeah, that's awesome.
But there's some awesome work being done across Virginia, of course, lots of different parts of the state, lots of different ways that teachers collaborate and support their multilingual learners. All right, so let's continue. Oh, I think I have to just go back here for a moment to identify the 3rd equity strategy as teaching and assessing our students to continue to build. So please allow me to emphasize that I'm not saying that they do not have autonomy, agency, or resilience, but our intentionality around supporting our students' autonomy, agency, so that they could become self-directed independent learners, so that they could set their own goals and we could nurture that kind of independence, that they could take charge and ownership of their own learning. And then we can support that by assessing them fairly and equitably and helping them set future goals so that we're putting them on that trajectory of independence. And the other dimension of this practice is what I referred to earlier already, is an integrated, accelerated approach to learning when we're not waiting around for the students to develop language and literacy in isolation. We have to connect their language and literacy development to content as well as social emotional learning. So that's how everything fits together. So what does it look like? The deliberate daily actions that are connected to this practice include multidimensional instructional strategies and equitable approaches to assessment as an assessment for learning. So students to self-assess, to peer assess, to set goals for themselves and monitor their own learning. And assessment for learning refers to formative assessment practices when teachers collaborate and co-assess, and they look at students' linguistic, cognitive, and social emotional development. So there is the beautiful sketch note by Claribel Gonzalez, who again captured the entire chapter as a painter's palette and just the rich, diverse instructional practices that we are infusing into our teaching to support our students' agency and autonomy. All right, so I'm going to invite you to think about this single prefix for a moment. It happened a couple of years before the pandemic that a particular group of educators that I was working with challenged me to give them a simple one-word answer to what are we going to be doing? What are we supposed to be doing with English learners? So I had to think very fast on my feet, and I put the prefix multi and right under it the word multiple on an anchor chart. And I invited my participants to just think of all kinds of constructs, concepts, ideas that begin with the prefix multi or the word multiple. I'm going to invite you to do the same thing. And that was my way out. That was my one-word answer, because there's no one-word answer. But to create a multidimensional instructional approach to serving multilingual learners, let's start with the prefix multi. So how would you finish any kind of a word that's related to our topic that begins with the prefix multi or multiple, if you want to look at a word? What would be a good way to capture what we can do for this population? I'm going to give you a moment. Productive wait time, right? So if you could think and add some ideas in the chat box. What associations do you have with the prefix multi? I already gave you one, which is multilingual. So honoring our students' multiple languages, securing resources in multiple languages, inviting bilingual peer bridges to work together so that the students' oracy and thinking could develop and transfer that understanding into English. Multiple needs, love that, absolutely. So recognizing that we can't teach to the middle. Every class is going to be very, very diverse. Even if the students have the same language proficiency level identified, their needs will significantly vary. All right, any other words or phrases? Multimodal, all right, lots of things are coming in now. Multimodal teaching, multitasking, multiple backgrounds the students bring to the classroom, and multiple roles that we play as educators or as students have to take on. Often they have adult responsibilities at home, many of our students, or challenging responsibilities. So I'll tell you what that group came up with. This was my original diagram. So very similar to what you said, we talked about multilingual. Multisensory came up in my conversation with that group so that we don't limit sensory experiences to young children, but all the way into secondary or even adult education. We involve multiple senses. Multimodal, that was mentioned by Tabitha earlier, so listening, speaking, reading, writing, engagement around multiple modalities, multiple grouping strategies. and multicultural resources. And I absolutely love your examples, multiplying their strengths, recognizing and honoring their multiple backgrounds and the multiple roles that they can play. And then more recently, I added a couple of additional dimensions to this multidimensional diagram, and you just gave me a lot of new ideas today as well to further expand this diagram to capture how we can honor multiple entry points for our students, to recognize that, especially in this kind of post-COVID world that we're hopefully entering in soon, some of our students will have a very different kind of starting point of re-entering their grade level education, and others will need a more accelerated type of learning. Multivocal refers to the opportunity for us to ensure that all students' voices are heard and their perspectives are honored. All right, so here are a couple of pictures. What you see on the left-hand side is a Padlet where the two teachers, Mrs. Holtkamp and Mrs. Boschneck, collaborated. They co-taught online during the pandemic and invited the students to write what-if poems. And they modeled that kind of writing. And then they invited the students to collaborate so that they could decide on which of these what-if questions could be turned into a collaborative research project, an online research project that they would then report back to the whole class. So collaboration between teachers, collaboration between students. You could see the two pictures, pre-pandemic pictures, of course, where you see that students interact with each other. They make sense of complex materials together. And the final strategy in this equity framework is related to harnessing the power of connections and relationships. When we create these healthy, safe learning environments for our students, where at the core of the learning experience is a trusting relationship between the community, parents, teachers, administrators, we're going to make sure that the students have a stronger sense of belonging, that they want to be there, they want to have a place, they know that they have a place in the classroom and they could be successful members of our communities. And we have to work at that. And the deliberate daily actions that in this chapter we present to you, and the sketch note represents an ecosystem in which we create a cohesive learning environment that's safe and welcoming and affirming, and where equity is at the center of everything we do. Community building, belonging, and purpose drives our daily work and instruction. Our students' social emotional well-being and freedom of expression is also supported. And I'd like to give a huge nod and acknowledgement to everybody else within a school community that supports students as well as educators' well-being, social workers, guidance counselors, teaching aides, whoever can offer mentoring, coaching, and other kinds of support will play an essential role in creating this ecosystem. And what does it look like? I am going to take you to two different schools. These are some examples from my co-planning book where there's an inside-outside circle without children. That's Justin, who wanted to be identified as Justin, and no children were allowed to be photographed in that context. But he generously shared this with me as an example of how building a community in the classroom could be rediscovering some strategies that we used before the pandemic. The inside-outside circle invites students on the inside to talk to each other, while the outside circle takes notes and observes how the conversation evolves in the center. And on the right-hand side, you could see three educators in Illinois who regularly co-plan, co-teach, co-assess, a classroom teacher, a middle school ELA teacher, an ESL, ELL teacher, and a special educator. So they have a three-way co-teaching partnership going. And in the classroom, we can create Kagan structures that further support multiple meaningful opportunities to interact with the material and with each other. Multiple roles could be taken on as well in a cooperative learning structure. In this rendition of the shoulder partners and face partners setup, Claribel Gonzalez shows us how the students first work together with those who sit right next to them, and then they repeat the same task or extend the learning task with their face partners. Okay, and again, some more beautiful dynamic pictures from various schools around the United States that I visited. And what you could see in every one of these pictures is just the chemistry, the connection, the dynamic by the teachers leaning in, the students feeling safe and supported as they are part of this school community. So moving forward in the chat box, I know I have shared a lot in a very short period of time. Where will you start, or where will you go next? Which of these 4 strategies stood out for you as a possible pathway for you to strengthen your own equity work or equity-oriented work? Where would you like to do more? If you have already started this kind of work, where would you like to build on your existing practice? Just add a number in the chat box, please. So we are practicing that appreciative inquiry and future-oriented pathway for our thinking. Where do you think you personally or educators in your own context will need to do more in support of multilingual learners? So I'm seeing again, number 4, getting a lot of attention, the power of connections and relationships, continue to nurture them. And some of you mentioned several other items as well. And yes, that's a good observation, that because we spend so much time here on focusing on personal connections with our students and their families. So refocusing our attention to either the assessment practices or the teaching practices, or even just the curriculum itself could be a next step. All right. So as I was thinking about how to leave you with some parting thoughts, I came up with the AAA approach. This is not in my publications, but something that I add on to my work, which is agency, assets, and acceleration. So this is where I would start, always honoring our students as capable students, always setting high expectations for them, because that's exactly where they're going to reach for. Recognizing them that they are already competent, that they have a lot of prior knowledge, prior experience, their language, their culture, their funds of knowledge and funds of identity that they bring to us will need to be acknowledged and honored and built upon. And finally, just revisiting this notion of acceleration, that we can't separate language acquisition from content development. We need to address language literacy, especially disciplinary literacy, the unique features of reading a math problem or writing a science report, and explicitly teaching those language and literacy skills that are needed in the moment rather than in a more sequential way will help these students to accelerate their learning. So a possible next step could be for you to consider these 4 dimensions of your own practice. What are some past practices that you definitely want to hold on to? Something that always worked, your go-to strategies. What were some pandemic practices that you discovered during the pandemic? Maybe some technology-based practices. What are some current practices in the moment as we are transitioning out of the pandemic, hopefully, that you want to hold on? And what kind of goals do you have for the future? And I actually have a Google document that I'd like to share with you. I'll put it in the chat box. And if we have time, we can decide on going into some breakout rooms, or just, since it's a small group, if you wanted to just unmute and have a little bit of a conversation with everyone, that would be fine too. Whatever is your preference, we could quickly set up a 5-minute breakout room or stay together. If you wanted to share in the chat box what your preference is. No breakout rooms. All right. Now I think we're all zoomed out. Let's just stay together. I agree with you. Let's just enjoy each other's virtual presence and stay here together and just think about it, how we can again honor and appreciate existing practices, past practices, So not taking that deficit or damaged oriented view of what is happening to us, but honoring and practicing and continue to practice what works best. So evidence-based research informed best practices that we can take with us into the future. And that document, the Google document, you could certainly use, you could take it back, make a copy of it, and use it with your colleagues as well. All right, so I am going to, in a moment, open up for questions and conversations, but I wanted to tell you that I will be offering a Twitter raffle. And if you wanted to participate, please tweet one key takeaway from today's session, and you can tag me so that I know that you did it. Otherwise, I won't be able to recognize you as a Twitter raffle participant. So Andrea Honix found no D. That's not a typo. There's no D at the end of my Twitter handle. And you could also add equity for MLS. And I will be raffling off one of each of these books. So the chances are pretty good because we have a small group here. So go ahead and do some Twitter raffle entries. And oh, if you don't have Twitter, okay, it was actually brought to my attention. So I'm going to do this. If you don't have Twitter, I'm going to give you my Gmail address. And in the name of equity, we're not going to exclude you. So if you do not use Twitter, you could email me your key takeaway and I will enter you into the Twitter raffle, even though you're not tweeting, which is perfectly fine. All right. So either use my email that's in the chat box or tweet just a quick takeaway and tag me so that I know that it's on Twitter. Otherwise, it wouldn't come to me. And sure. Thank you. And I would like to now stop the share and invite all of you to come back, maybe turn on your cameras so that we could have a conversation about what questions you have, what challenges do you face, in what way did this session validate your practice or your thinking, or maybe challenge your thinking, and you might have new ideas or new questions as a result of my workshop with you.
For me, the workshop was great. I work with adult immigrants, and it's good to see what is out there, and I'm trying to process it. How can I convert it to use it for the adult immigrant that I'm working with, in my school right now? So that's what is going through my mind right now.
I think the framework is going to be very similar for adult education. That's when I started my career as well. My very first job as a new arrival to the United States, to New York, was to teach adults on Saturday mornings from 8 to 12 in Woodside, Queens in New York City. And I will never forget that experience because most of my students only had Saturday off or maybe Sunday off, and they spent 4 hours to learn English only to go back to their jobs that afternoon. So I have so much respect for the immigrant community. So the same philosophy that let's put our students first and let's truly get to know them, build relationships with them, recognize their assets and their strengths so that they feel validated, heard, and seen. Then focusing on the curriculum. What are we teaching these adult learners? Is it relevant? Is it truly going to help them succeed? Not the same way as a K-12.
Yeah.
In the K-12 context, the students have to pass tests and maybe go on to college, but an adult learner in an adult context will also need to be able to meet their goals and be successful. Yeah. And then our own teaching. In what way is our teaching supportive of their autonomy, their agency, so that they could become more confident to use the language, to use their skills, and to continue to learn on their own. So I think the framework is going to hold up in any context. But thank you so much for raising that's what you're grappling with, how to transfer all of these ideas to your unique context. And I'm so appreciative that you're still here, even though it might not have been exactly related to your everyday practice, but
Well, it can be, it's still useful very much. You know, I see my good friend Kaylin there, you know, so it's all good.
Thank you. Kaylin, you wanted to add something to that too?
Yeah, so I do work with Ernest, also with adults. And I was thinking about when you talked about equity of access, something that happened to me right when the pandemic started, and we shifted from entirely in person to entirely virtual. There was a student in my class who, when we were in person, I had a very deficit attitude about her. I perceived her as not serious about the class. She would come late, and I thought, like, she doesn't take this class seriously. And then when we switched to virtual, my perception of her changed to like, wow, she is a very serious student, and she's on our learning management system in the middle of the night doing the activities that I built. And I realized that what I had believed before was completely wrong. It was this access issue, the timing of the class or coming in person. And by moving into virtual, we actually saw some students blossom and be more successful. Wow. Because they had access to learning that was asynchronous or virtual. And so they were able to do it from home. And I think it was like a big learning moment for me to question, whenever I have a negative perception of a student, what's actually happening there. And I hope that we continue to have these flexible options. So that's something that I want to leave behind my bad attitude about students. And then in moving forward, I hope that our school continues to have these flexible instructional modes.
Thank you so much. That really takes a lot of courage to be so self-reflective and be able to say that, well, wait a minute, I was wrong. I had some preconceived notions about my students, and the pandemic opened my eyes. So thank you so much, Kaylin. I really appreciate that. What you said reminded me of the power of technology as well. It was many years ago when my oldest son, who's now going to go to medical school, was in high school. And I was a very strict mom at that time, and I was monitoring computer use. And one day he said to me, "Mom, you don't understand. I have to get on the computer right away." They said, no, you do your homework first, then you go on the computer. And he said, "You really don't understand. The homework is on the computer. I have to go on Khan Academy and watch this short video." I said, "All right, let me see what this Khan Academy is all about. I'll sit with you." And I watched with you. You see, I wasn't very trusting either. I acknowledge that. And then I was in awe of watching this child figuring out that he can pause, he can rewind, he can put the subtitles on to better understand the explanations for this, whatever it was, like some kind of equation. And immediately I thought, and it was way before COVID, it was a long, long time ago, that wait a minute, this is what our English learners need. They can't pause us in the middle of the lesson. They can't rewind us. They can't put subtitles under us. But what if we used multimedia, if we use technology more? And now because of COVID, everybody has done that. Flipgrid and many other tools allow our multilingual learners to use technology in an interactive way, to watch each other, to watch themselves, to record themselves, re-record, and so forth. So lots of opportunities for us to infuse new technologies that are a lot more flexible and on honoring the students' own time as well. So any last comments or questions from anybody? If not, I'm going to ask Tabitha or Greer if you wanted to wrap up the session for tonight. And again, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, for a very helpful and interesting and meaningful presentation. So we would like to announce to everyone that we have a call for proposals open for other webinars in what we hope will be a robust spring webinar series. So if you have a topic that you would like to present on, we would very much like to welcome you to host a webinar in this platform as well. So thank you everyone for attending. We have really enjoyed the presentation by Andrea, and we hope that we will have more interesting presentations like this in the future. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you,
you.
everyone.
All right, thank you.
Looking forward to your raffle entries so that I could give away the books that I got from the publisher. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.